All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 5 of the WSGA rules review sessions. Today we'll be going over rules 20 through 25, and we will start with Dan with rule 20.
Good morning, everybody. It's rule 20 today, and then we're going to zip through the rest of them. They should go a little faster today. At least I'm thinking that they will. Rule 20, resolving rules issues during round, rulings by referee and committee. Here's the purpose statement. Rule 20 covers what players should do when they have questions about the rules during the round, including the procedures, which differ in match and stroke play, allowing the player to protect their rights. The rules also cover the rules of a referee who's authorized to decide questions of fact and apply the rules. Rulings by a referee or committee are binding on all players. We're going to go through this in more detail, but it's a very interesting statement. Rulings by referees or committees are binding on all players. So let's look at the definition of referee. It's on page 356. The USGA did a good job for 2023 in moving some of the matters that were in either interpretations or clarifications or in the committee procedures and putting them into the rules themselves so that you can find them easier and rely on them. A referee is one of them. The old definition was just the first sentence, an official named by the committee to decide questions of fact and apply the rules. So let's look at the rest of them. That is now what we have for 2023, although I should say this is not really a change. It's just a movement of this information from the committee procedure into the definition. In match play, a referee's duties and authorities depend on their assigned role. When a referee is assigned to one match for the entire round, the referee is responsible for acting on any breach of the rules they see or are told about. When a referee is assigned to multiple matches or to certain holes or sections of the course, they have no authority to become involved in a match unless, and we're going to go through these, but the first thing to keep in mind is if it's a match play and you have 4 officials and there are 8 matches out there, you're probably not assigned to one specific match. So then you're under the clause that says you have no authority to get involved in a match unless, so let's go through these. A player is in match, asks for help. That's kind of the standard way you're going to get involved, not just in match play, but in any sense of play. It is unusual that you just hit upon something, discover that somebody is doing something, and then you tell them what to do. In the vast, vast majority of cases, you're asked by a player to help them with a ruling or tell them what the rules are. And in match play, if you are not assigned to the match and you ask, you are allowed to help out. The next few items are a player or players in match may be in breach of 1.2, standard of care, 1.3, 2 or more players agree to ignore a rule. These are spirit of the game rules in which we want the referees to take action when they see them. The next couple are pace of play ones, when to start, pace of play 5.6. So you can get involved in those. Otherwise, you can't get involved if you see something unless you are asked. In stroke play, a referee is responsible for acting on any breach of the rules they see or are told about. This applies whether the referee is assigned to one group for the entire round or to monitor multiple groups, certain holes or parts of the course. A referee's duty may be limited by the committee in match or stroke play. Normally with the WSGA, we don't limit referees' duties at higher level events, perhaps a USGA event. Often the ability to declare something as ground under repair is limited to the rover or the person in charge of a certain area. And the reason they do that is so that you have consistency throughout the course. All right, so let's look at Rule 20, resolving rules issues during the round. The 20.18, players must avoid unreasonable delay. This is true both stroke play and match play. If a referee or committee is not available within a reasonable time, the players must decide what to do and play on. In stroke play, you protect your rights by playing 2 balls, and in match play, you protect your rights by requesting your ruling request. All right, let's go through match play first. Deciding issues by agreement. During a round, the players in the match may agree how to decide a rules issue. The agreed outcome is conclusive, even if it turns out to have been wrong. So the example is you ask your opponent, can I drop from here from the cart path? And your opponent says, yeah, that's the way I drop. Even though it's incorrect, you've agreed, you're allowed to do that. The only thing you can't do is you can't have an agreement to ignore any rule or penalty that you know applies. So the example typically given is if you see your partner with 15 clubs, you can tell them that it's a penalty. You can tell them you're going to call it, but you can't start a negotiations and say, well, let's agree on how we're going to handle this. We both know it's a breach of the rules, but I'm not going to call it if you take a certain club out of play. Then you've got an agreement to breach the rules. That is not permitted. The vast majority of match plays at club events, people breach the rules fairly regularly, innocently. The other side doesn't know it. They don't know it. On they go, and the match is concluded, and that's the way it is, and no claim is made. The referee is assigned to the match. The referee must rule on any issue that comes to their attention. And again, that's a referee that is assigned to that specific match. In the absence of a referee, if the players do not agree or have doubts about the rules, either player may request a ruling under 20.1b2. So let's look at ruling requests. And we're going to look at them before the result of the match is final, and then decide, and then look at how we do it once the match is final. When a player wants a referee or a committee to decide how to apply the rules to their own play or the opponent's play, the player must make a request for a ruling. There's 2 parts to this. You must make the request on time, which we're going to go through in a minute, and you must make the request fact specific so that the opponent and or ultimately the committee can decide what it is that you're making a ruling request. It's not enough simply to say, I don't know what you did on that hole, but I'm making a request for a ruling. That's not sufficient. You have to say something like, you touched the sand in the bunker, I'm making a ruling request on that issue. The referee committee is not available in a reasonable time. The player may make the request for a ruling by notifying the opponent that a later ruling will be sought by the committee. If the player makes a request for a ruling before the result of the match is final, a ruling will be given only if the request is made in time, which depends on when the player becomes aware of the facts creating a rules issue. First thing to know about this is when the player becomes aware of the facts, not when the player becomes aware that it is a breach of the rules. So when a player becomes aware of the facts before either player starts the final hole, when the player becomes aware of the facts, the ruling request made before either player makes a stroke to begin another hole. So let's take a simple example. You're playing the first hole, you look over, you see your partner your opponent take a practice swing in the sand, touching the sand. When do you have to make a claim? Before either player tees off on hole number 2. If you don't do it, it's too late. When player becomes aware of the facts during or after completion of the final hole of the match, the ruling request must be made before the result of the match is final. So you could have a situation in which the match is ostensibly over. You're walking back to the clubhouse and you have a ruling issue that you just become aware of. And this is, let's look at clarification 20.1b, parent 2/2. This is on page 276. If a player becomes aware of a possible breach of the rules by their opponent after completing what they thought was the final hole, the player may make a request for a ruling. If the player was in breach of the rule, the adjusted match score may require the players to return. So here's the example. In match play between A and B, B wins by a score of 5 up with 4 to go. So they finish the 14th hole. He's 5 up with 4 to go. They start walking in. On the way back to the clubhouse before the result of the match is final, it's discovered that player B had 15 clubs in their bag. Player A requests a ruling, and the committee determines correctly that the ruling request by player A was made in time. Why is it made in time? Because he just discovered it. He didn't discover it earlier. The players must return to the 15th hole and resume the match. The score in the match is adjusted by deducting 2 holes from player B, and player B now is 3 up with 4 holes to go. So what happens on an adjustment penalty, this is rule 4.1, the penalty section, you deduct 2 holes. It's an adjustment penalty, you deduct 2 holes. So instead of being 5 up, you're only 3 up. Well, if you're 3 up and there's 4 holes left to play, the match isn't over, so you got to go back to the 15th hole and play again. The other thing to be aware of is when you discover or are aware of the facts, you may not be able to discover or become aware of the facts until several holes later. So as an example, on the first hole, you lose the hole. Your partner, unbeknownst to you, has taken a practice swing in the bunker. You get to the 4th hole, you're watching your opponent, and your opponent takes a practice swing touching the sand, and you say to him, "I'm sorry, that's a loss of hole penalty." And he says, "Well, why is that?" "Well, you touched the sand when you were taking your practice swing in the bunker." "Oh, I didn't know that was a rule. I did that back on hole number 1, and you didn't call it out." Now the player has the ability to make a claim not only for the breach on the 4th hole, but the breach on the 1st hole, because he just became aware of it. And notice that both of those requests for a ruling must be made before either player tees off on the 5th hole. And if the request is made, the committee should determine that the player is correct and he should win the 1st hole and 4th hole in my example. If the player does not make a request in time, a ruling will not be given by a referee or the committee, and the result of the hole in question will stand, even if the rules were applied in the wrong way. This happens in the vast majority of club events. Someone doesn't like what happens, they finish the round, they're complaining at the bar that such and such did such and such. And you go into the pro, and the pro says, "Well, the first question you ask is, did you make a timely ruling request?" And they usually say, "Well, what do you mean by a timely ruling request?" When someone asks that, that means they probably didn't make a timely ruling request, and therefore it's going to stand as played. If the player requests a ruling about an earlier hole, this will be given only if all 3 of these apply, and we just went over an example of that. The opponent breaches a rule, giving the wrong number of strokes or failing to tell a player about a penalty. The request is based on facts the player was not aware of. This is the 1st hole, 4th hole example I gave. After becoming aware of the facts, the player then makes the request in a timely fashion. In other words, in the example I gave before they tee off on the 5th hole. All right, ruling requests made after the result of the match is final. And the committees have to decide when the result of a match is final. The WSGA has it on its hard card. It's when the competition is final, when a trophy has been presented to the winner, which is normally done immediately after the players get back to the clubhouse. When a player makes a request for a ruling after the result of the match is final, the committee will give a player a ruling only if both of these apply. This is the fraud exception. This is the cheating exception. Here's what it says. The request is based on facts the player was not aware of before the result. So the player doesn't know about it. The opponent breached a particular rule, fails to tell the opponent, and this is the key, and knew of the breach before the result of the match. In other words, they deliberately are cheating. I guess cheating by definition is deliberate, but what I'm saying is this is a player not playing according to the rules. They know very well that they're not playing against the rules. There's no time limit on giving such a ruling. Again, I think of this as the fraud exception. Parent 4, no right to play 2 balls. A player who is uncertain about the right procedure in a match is not allowed to play out the hole with 2 balls. That procedure applies only in a stroke play. So if you're playing a match, the other person says, well, I don't like that ruling, I'm going to play 2 balls. The minute they play the second ball, they have played a wrong ball. What can you do about it? You have to make a ruling request before either party tees off on the next hole. So if you allow them to play 2 balls, there is no penalty for playing a wrong ball. But the committee, when you get in there, the committee will not decide this issue. It will simply say the original ball play counts. Well, what if it wasn't? No, you don't get into an analysis. The original ball counts. There's a clarification on that. We won't go over it. It's 20.1B, parent 4/1, which makes this very point that the original ball counts in that situation. Let's look at stroke play. Contrary to match play, there's no right to decide a rules issue by agreement. If the referee and the committee are unavailable, the players are encouraged to help each other, but they have no right to decide a rules issue by agreement, and any such agreement they reach is not binding on any player, the referee, or the committee. The players should raise any issues with the committee before returning their scorecard. Players should protect other players in the field. To protect the interest of all players, if a player knows or believes that another player has breached or might have breached a rule, and the other player does not recognize or ignores this, the player should, this is not mandatory, but it says should, tell the other player, the player's marker, a referee, or a committee. So if you're playing in stroke play, you see somebody drop in the wrong place, you're encouraged to tell them that they dropped in the wrong place so that they can correct it. This should be done promptly after the player becomes aware of the issue and no later than before the other player returns their scorecard, unless it is not possible to do so. And here's the kicker. If the player fails to do so, the committee may disqualify the player under the serious misconduct rule 1.2a if it decides that this serious misconduct is contrary to the spirit of the game. This is sort of the anti-sandbagging rule. You can't sit back while your fellow competitor tees off in front of the tee markers. He finishes the hole, tees off, and then say, you're disqualified because it was a must correct. What this is saying, if the player fails to notify the committee can then have a little discussion with the player and can decide whether they want to disqualify the player for serious misconduct. We had an interesting situation at Erin Hills, the 16th hole at Erin Hills, which is a par 3. It was a college tournament. One of the players hit first. The quote fellow competitor, another player on a different team, went over to the player's bag, pulled the towel that the first player had over his bag to look to see what club the player had used. Well, that's a breach of 10.2a. The player noticed this. He told his coach, and the coach advised him to bring it to the committee's attention when you got into the scoring so that the player could not get disqualified for failing to bring this to the committee's attention. So this was brought to the committee's attention. The other player did get a 2-stroke penalty for breach of 10.2a, and the player that brought it to the committee's attention then did what he's supposed to do to protect the field. All right, parent 3, playing 2 balls when uncertain what to do. A player who is uncertain about the right procedure while playing a hole may complete the hole with 2 balls without penalty. So the first question is, does the player have virtually absolute right to decide to play 2 balls? The answer to that is generally yes, because if the player is uncertain of that they're playing the right procedure, the rule says that the player may play 2 balls without penalty. The player must decide to play 2 balls after the uncertain situation arises and before making a stroke. This is always on the national exam. A player's ball is in the ground under repair area. He plays it and then decides, oh, wait, I think that was ground under repair. I think I got relief. I'm going to decide to play 2 balls. At that point, it's too late. You have to make the determination that you're going to play 2 balls after the uncertainty arises and before you play another stroke. The player should choose which ball will count if the rules allow the procedure for that ball by announcing that choice to their marker. Notice the third bullet point is there is a choice that is always going to be made. Either the player makes that choice, or if the player does not make it, the rules themselves will make the choice for you, and the choice that the rules will make for you is the ball played first. Notice it does not say the original ball, it says the ball played first. And under this rule, you can play either ball in either order. So sometimes you may play the ball that you think is in the ground under repair. You may play that first and then take relief outside, or you may take relief outside first and then play the ball as it lies in the ground under repair. Player must report the facts of the situation to the committee before returning the scorecard, even if the player scores the same with both balls. Severe penalty if you don't, the player is disqualified. Why do you have such a severe penalty? The reason is because, by definition, the player doesn't know what he's doing. He's uncertain. So we want the committee to get involved, which is going to be paragraph 4, which we'll go over in a minute. If the player makes a stroke before deciding to play a second ball, this rule does not apply at all, and the score that counts is the score with the ball played before the player decided to play the second ball. But the player gets no penalty for playing the second ball. So this is an interesting rule. This protects the player for playing a second ball, but understand that under no circumstances is the second ball ever going to become the ball in play. It's just a way of protecting that player because he's uncertain of what to do. If you're ever in scoring, one of the things I always ask the players when they finish is, did anyone play 2 balls? And the reason you ask that is it takes you 5 seconds to say it. And once in a while, you'll get a player say, oh yeah, but I got the same score with both balls. Well, you've just now protected the player from being disqualified. All right, so what's the committee going to do? Once you've played 2 balls, the decision on what score you get is not yours. It now belongs to the committee. When a player plays 2 balls, the committee will decide the player's score for the hole in this way. As we go through this, one of the things to keep in mind is the rule is trying to protect the player. The player is not knowing what he's doing, or at least he's uncertain. So what the rules are going to do is to say, if the player's choosing something and it's allowed, we're going to let him do it. If he's not allowed to do it and we can avoid penalties, we're going to avoid penalties for the player. So here's the way it works. The score with the ball chosen, whether by the player or by default, counts if the rules allow the procedure for that ball. So the player's ball is in what he thinks is ground under repair. He then takes relief, plays a second ball. If the committee decides that it was in fact ground under repair, well, then the player could take relief, and he did, and assuming he does it correctly, that's the score that'll count. If the rules do not allow the procedure used for that ball, the score with the other ball played counts if the rules allow the procedure for that ball. So take the situation of the ostensible ground under repair. The committee determines that it is not ground under repair. Well, thus the ball that you played from outside was not played with the proper procedure because you're not allowed to do that. However, the player played his ball as it lies in the ground in the area that is ground under repair or was not ground under repair. Is he allowed to play the ball as it lies? Yes. So the rules are then going to default and say that's the score for the hole. If the rules do not allow the procedure used for each of the two balls, the score with the ball chosen counts unless it's a serious breach. The way to remember this, if both balls are played incorrect procedure, you're going to get your choice unless it's serious, and then you're going to pick the other one. So if there is one serious breach and one non-serious breach, the rules are going to let you pick the non-serious breach. Otherwise, you'd be disqualified. And then the fourth point, if there's a serious breach in playing each ball from the wrong place, the player is disqualified. Why? Because there's no ball in play. You haven't properly finished the hole. All strokes with the ball that does not count, including strokes from any penalty strokes solely from playing that ball, do not count. We've had this expression solely from playing that ball before. The penalties that would not be solely relate to such things as giving advice, which could apply to either ball. Rules allowed, this is internal definition on the top of page 272. Rules allow the procedure used means either the original ball was played as it lies and play was allowed from there. So the example that I gave of the ground under repair, even though it's ground under repair, you can always play your ball from that situation. Or B, the ball that was played was put in play under the right procedure, in the right way, and in the right place under the rules. So if you have a situation where you're not sure that it's ground under repair, you then take appropriate relief. But instead of dropping within 1 club length, you drop within 2 club lengths. That second ball that you're playing, the rules do not allow that procedure used. Therefore, you're going to revert to the first one, even though you hoped that you could play as ground under repair. 20.2, rulings on issues under the rules. The referee is official named by the committee to decide questions of fact and apply the law. The referee may get the committee's help before making a ruling. A referee's ruling on facts and how the rules apply must be followed by the player. A player has no right to appeal a referee's ruling to the committee, but after a ruling has been made, the referee may get a second opinion. I cannot think of a situation that I've ever been in where if a player asks for a second opinion, I have said no. And the reason is if you're a rules official, there's only 2 situations that apply. You are 100% sure that your ruling is correct, or you're less than 100%. If you're less than 100%, that means you have doubt. So in those 2 situations, if you're 100% sure that you're right, why wouldn't you want another person to come along and say, yes, you're right? You shouldn't have to fear that situation. If you have some doubt, don't you want somebody else to give an opinion, to confirm, to make sure that you are right? Your goal is to get the decision right. So again, it's hard to imagine any situation in which I would say to the player, no, I'm not going to give you a second opinion. On the way down here, I was thinking about what if the guy hit the ball out of bounds, it goes through the neighbor's house, the glass breaks, and the player says, well, I'm just going to drop a ball up there by the neighbor's house. I would say, no, you have to play under stroking distance. If the player said, well, I think you're wrong on that, I'd like a second opinion. The point is, you have a radio. It's fairly easy to say, okay, sir, if that's the way you feel, you get on the radio and you say, Jeff, I got a guy here, he hit his ball out of bounds. Can you confirm that it's stroking distance? And then Jeff says, yes, that sounds right to me. And then on you go. It doesn't cost you much. It gives the player confidence that you as the rules official know what you're doing. We had an interesting situation on the 4th hole at University Ridge. I think Gary Wild was there. It was a Badger tournament. A player hit his ball. The 4th hole is an uphill par 4. The player hit his ball and it embedded either in the general area or in the bunker. And the bunker was poorly defined, or at least the edge was poorly defined. So you couldn't tell precisely whether the ball was in or out. So I got called on the radio to come over. I then looked at it and I said, in my opinion, the ball is in the bunker, so you don't get free relief. And the player said, and his coach said, well, we disagree. We think you're wrong. And I said, well, that's fine. Here's what I'm going to do. So I got out my camera, my cell phone, and I took a picture of it real close. And then I backed up about 10 feet and I took another picture so that you could see the overall lay of the land. And I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this to the committee, and the committee will then make the determination. But since this is a stroke play event and the people are backing up on the fairway on the fourth hole, if you want to, you can play 2 balls to protect your rights. The player played 2 balls. On they went. We sent it around, and I think it was Gary Wild, and I think it was Thomas was the other one. The 3 of us agreed that the ball was in fact in the bunker, and so the player did not get free relief. But the point is, there's no reason to tell the player, look, I'm the boss. I know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. The easiest thing is, if it's a factual determination, to take a picture of the facts and then have the committee make the overall decision. Another example is sometimes a player will say, are you sure you're right about the ruling? And if it's a factual question, it often makes sense to take a picture on the cell phone. If it's not a factual ruling and it's purely a ruling based on what the rule says, I've often said to the player, well, the ruling is such and such, and the reason is because of rule number 12.13, or isn't 1.3, but 12.2. And then the person looks at you and says, oh, they know the rules, they must know it. And then I've even said, okay, I'm happy to call the tournament director if you think that's wrong. And the person then often will say, no, I believe you. But if they don't believe you, there's no harm in getting on the radio and saying, this is what happened, what's the ruling? All right. A referee's decision is final. So if the referee authorizes the player to breach a rule in error, the player will not be penalized. But for when a wrong ruling by a referee or committee will be corrected, see 20.2D. We're going to go over that in just a minute. Rulings by committee. When there is no referee to give a ruling, or when a referee refers a ruling to the committee, the ruling given by the committee will be given by the committee, and the committee's ruling is final. It is not uncommon for me to get a telephone call from some high school coach who I happen to know, says, well, this is what happened at the such and such, and and the following, is that right? And my response is, yes, it's right, because the committee's determination is final. Well, but is it right? And I said, the committee's decision is final. The committee's decision is right. And then they say, oh, I get it. Well, but do you think the ruling was actually right? And then I usually try and be diplomatic, although I don't always succeed. I say, well, I'm not going to get into whether they're right or wrong. I'm just going to tell you what the rule says. And the rule says if you hit your ball here and then you do this and then you do that, it's a 1-stroke penalty or it's a 2-stroke penalty. And I go. But the key is the committee's decision is final. And it has to be that way. Otherwise, we'd have tournaments forever going on after the fact, especially when you have a committee that's, I'll just say, a little less sophisticated than the committee for the US Open. 20.2C, applying naked eye standard when using video evidence. This doesn't come up in the WSGA events. We don't typically have cameras out there with video evidence. But the point of this, if the facts shown on the video could not reasonably have seen by the naked eye, the video evidence will be disregarded, even if it indicates a breach of the rules. If you ever went to one of the USGA seminars in the past, they used to show the video of a person chipping from, say, 20 or 30 feet from the hole. They were hitting a low running shot. They show the video. Anybody say anything wrong with that? No. Anybody see a double hit? No. And then you watch it 3 or 4 times and you see nothing. Then they put super slow motion. You see the player hit the ball bounces up. The club then hits the ball the second time. Now the rule's been changed, but the point is that's something that could not have been seen by the naked eye. So you just play on, and if somebody shows a video, you disregard the video evidence unless the player knew of the breach by some other mechanism. Felt that, so you ask the player, did you think you hit it twice? This is a bad example because now you're permitted to hit the ball twice, but the example usually is, did you understand that you ground your club in the sand? No, I don't think so. Did you feel it? No, I don't think so. Did anyone see it? No, I don't think I did. And then they show the video, and there's a famous one of Anna Norquist at 2016 US Open where the super slow-mo video shows that she did touch the sand. Well, the rule's now been changed. She would not get penalized for that because it could not be seen by the naked eye. All right, 20.2D, wrong rulings and administrative mistakes. Again, the USGA has done a nice job of pulling some of the stuff that used to be in the committee procedures into the rules. I always have to preface this by saying there's an old saw. There's 2 types of rules officials, those who have made a mistake and those who will make a mistake. So rest assured, you will make a mistake if you haven't done it yet. And when you make a wrong ruling, there are certain steps that you have to go through. So let's go through them. A wrong ruling has occurred when a referee or a committee has attempted to apply the rules, but does so incorrectly. Examples, you apply a wrong penalty or fail to apply a penalty. You apply a rule that does not apply. You misinterpret a rule and apply it incorrectly. If a ruling by a referee or committee is later found to be wrong, the ruling will be corrected if possible under the rules. And here's the key: if it is not too late to do so, the wrong rule, if it's too late to do so, the wrong ruling will stand. Let's look at page 430, which is some committee procedure guidance on this issue. Page 430. There's a slight difference between match play and stroke play, but let's start with a very common situation. You're called over, you're a rules official. The player says, do I get free relief from this ball that's in a sand-filled divot in the middle of the fairway? And you say yes. And so then the player picks up their ball and they're about to take relief, or maybe they actually drop the ball and the light goes on and you said, oh, I made a mistake. You have to correct the mistake. The player hasn't made a stroke yet. So what do? You tell the player to put it back. Does the player get penalized? No. This is as if a third party had come along and kicked the ball. What does the player do? They have to put it back in the spot. Is it embarrassing? Yes. Do you have to correct it? Yes. And there's no reason not to. You just apologize. You say, I'm sorry, it's my mistake. You didn't get free relief. This is under correction of wrong rulings by a referee during a match. A referee should not correct a wrong ruling after either player makes the next stroke. So if we're talking about match play, if the player goes on to make the stroke, then you're not going to correct the error unless we have a serious breach. And in match play, if you have a serious breach, you're going to correct the error provided the opponent has not played. Why? Because once the opponent plays, they base their strategy on that situation. Let's look at serious breach in stroke play. Page 432. At the top of the page, this is correction of wrong rulings by referee in stroke play. When possible, a referee should correct a wrong ruling in stroke play that involves the incorrect application of a penalty or a failure to apply a penalty, provided the competition is not closed. An example of that in stroke play is you advise the player that when he improved the conditions affecting the stroke, he gets a 1-stroke penalty. Then a couple holes later, you realize, no, that's really that's really a two-stroke penalty. So then you go and you tell the player that it's a two-stroke penalty, not a one-stroke penalty. You have that obligation to correct that mistake. Playing from a wrong place. If a player makes a stroke based on your ruling and he plays from the wrong place and it's not a serious mistake, you don't correct it. On you go. So an example would be the person drops their ball under your supervision, taking relief from a sprinkler head near the putting green. The ball rolls a couple of inches onto the putting green where it should have been remaining on the fringe. The player plays it. They have played from a wrong place. This is not a serious breach. You don't correct it. If it's a serious breach, then you're going to correct it until the player makes a stroke from the next hole. And if you make a mistake that is not necessary to be corrected, but you know you made a mistake, it is good practice to go up to the group and tell them that you made a mistake 2 holes back, and they shouldn't have dropped 2 club lengths from the cart pad. They should have only dropped 1 club length. Inform them that they don't get a penalty for that, but they better in the future know that the rule is 1 club length rather than 2. Otherwise, they could then be in a situation where further on in that competition, they're relying on the incorrect ruling that you gave earlier in the round. All right, 20 points. Administrative mistakes. An administrative mistake is different than a wrong ruling. An administrative mistake is a procedure error in relation to the administrative of the competition, and there's no time limit for correcting such a mistake. Even after the result of the match is final or the stroke play competition has closed, an administrative mistake is different than a wrong ruling. Examples: miscalculating the results of a tie, miscalculating a handicap, awarding a prize to the wrong person. So an example, you finish, you go into scoring, all the scores there, you have players 1, 2, and 3 that are entitled to a prize, and somehow you overlook the fact that this player's score was actually better than the 1, 2, or 3. If you award that prize to the wrong person, the committee then is obligated to correct the mistake by awarding the person the position that they should have gotten. 20.2e, disqualifying the player after result of match or competition is final. The light bulb should go on that if this is after the competition is over, we're probably going to have to be something pretty serious to disqualify a player after the round is over. There's no time limit on disqualifying a player under Rule 1.2, serious misconduct, 1.3b1, deliberately failing to apply a rule or agreeing with another player to ignore any rule. This may be done even after the result of the match is final, or when the committee will give a ruling when a request is made after the result. See 20.1b3. That's the so-called fraud exception. All right, stroke play. Normally, a penalty must not be applied or corrected after a stroke play competition has closed, which is when the result becomes final in the way set by the committee. And again, the WSGA on its hard card says when the trophy has been presented to the winner. But a player may be disqualified even after the competition is closed if they, now let's go through these. Bear in mind that these are really akin to cheating or fraud. Returning a score for any hole lower than actually taken, except that the player is not disqualified if the reason for the lower score is the exclusion of 1 or more penalty strokes that the player did not know about. In other words, it's not cheating if you honestly didn't know that you incurred a penalty. You're not going to be disqualified. However, if you know that you got the penalty and you failed to add it, then you're going to be disqualified. Next bullet point, new before the competition had closed that they were in breach of any rule with a penalty of disqualification, or agreed with another player to ignore any rule that they knew applied. Committee may also disqualify a player under 1.2 serious misconduct after the competition has closed. Serious misconduct could be physical abuse. You find out somebody beat somebody over the head with a 5-iron. As a committee, you don't have to put up with that. 20.2F is new for 2023, ineligible player. There is no time limit for correcting the result of a competition when a player who has competed is found to have been ineligible according to the terms of the competition. So you have a junior event, and the age limit is they cannot be older than 18. The player is 20 years old, they compete and they win. You find out about this, you then effectively, you don't disqualify the player, you just eliminate that player and you treat them as if they never entered. So that player is gone, and then the number 2 player then becomes the number 1 player. 20.3, this is the old equity rule. Situations not covered by the rules. Any situation not covered by the rules should be decided by the committee, considering all circumstances, treating the situation in a way that's reasonable, fair, and consistent. This is not a rule, and I repeat that, this is not a rule that you apply when you don't like the outcome that the rules give you. This is only a rule that is applied when there truly is no answer and you don't know how to proceed. Then you are forced to make some determination because the competition has to end. I think I gave this example in the past, but it's the only time I've used this rule on the course, and that is it was the old model local rule E3 that said if the player's ball is in an area of the course cut to fairway height or less, the player then gets free relief. And the expression was cut to fairway height or less. The player's ball was partially on the rough and partially on the fairway. Is the ball in an area that is cut to fairway height or less? Well, there's nothing in the rules that tell you how you resolve an issue between a fairway and a rough. It just is not in the rules. So you have to make a determination. At the time, I made the determination that any part of the ball touching it would be on the fairway. I base that on the fact that that's the way the putting green rule works. That's the way the bunker rule works. So I thought that was a reasonable way to do it. The model local rule E3 has since been corrected, and it now reads, if any part of the ball touches the fairway cut to fairway height or less, then you're going to get relief. All right, any questions on Rule 20?
If a match is final, and say, Dan, you and I are playing, we're on the 17th hole, you win 3-1. On 17, let's suppose that your ball moved in you addressing the ball, you knew it, you replaced the ball back, but you didn't tell me. So now we shake hands, you won the match 3-1, you were 2 up going into 17. We're at lunch, say somebody else in the group saw the ball, your ball move, and now informs me of that situation. Do I have a right to ask for a ruling from the committee? Or is it too late after we're having lunch and having a beer?
Well, I don't think the operative trigger point is the lunch versus the beer. The question is, did I know on the 17th hole that I breached the rules and deliberately did not tell you? If I, and in your example, I forget exactly what you said, but if I breached a rule, didn't know it was a rule, and the match is final, that's it.
Yeah, okay. But suppose you knew, then would the committee maybe rule, would they rule that you didn't tell me of a penalty that you incurred, and then we go back out and play? Or that may be more of a serious breach of you cheating.
Well, I think the committee always has the right under Rule 1.2A to disqualify a player if they believe that the player has engaged in serious misconduct. But you have to be pretty sure that it was serious misconduct. I'm not saying cheating is not serious misconduct, but I guess there's various shades of cheating, if there is such an expression.
Getting to the bottom of that issue, I mean, is you have to, somebody has to admit guilt. Yeah, I did it and I knew it.
Okay.
If they say, well, yeah, I did it, but I didn't know that was a problem. Well, then if he says that, match stands. If he says, yeah, I did it.
Okay.
Yeah, I did it, and I don't care because I don't really like it and I wanted to win. Then that's, but again, as
Okay.
everybody is, the
And
rules are easy, the facts are hard.
And it's not, does the player in the abstract know that the touching, whatever your example was, is a breach of the rules? The question is, when the player engaged in this behavior, did they know it was a breach of the rules? And you can have situations where a knowledgeable rules official is playing a match and forgets the rules, or
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot all about that.
And
Any other questions on 20? Good job.
Nothing from online.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to start off with a correction from last week. That when I was teaching Rule 18, the question was raised as to what the ruling is if a player's ball comes to rest out of bounds and then natural forces cause the ball to move inbounds. And a friend who used to be a rules chair for the Royal Canadian Golf Association pointed out that I was wrong with my answer. I had said, well, the ball was inbounds, the player would play it. And that is incorrect. That the answer is that the ball is out of is that the player must proceed under stroke and distance. And the reason is, if you look under the definition of ball in play, it says the player's ball is no longer in play if it comes to rest out of bounds. And there's no mechanism in the rules that allows that ball to become in play again. And specifically Rule 9.3, which deals with the ball being moved by natural forces, applies to a ball that is in play, and therefore would not have applied to a ball that was out of bounds. So you put all that together, player's not allowed to play a ball that's not in play, and the player is forced to proceed under stroke and distance. So thank you to Jack for pointing that out. So now back to where we are today with Rule 21, which covers several different forms of stroke play as well as match play. So with that in mind, let's look at a few definitions. First is maximum score, which is one of the formats we'll look at on page 345. It's a form of stroke play where players or side score is capped at a maximum number of strokes set by the committee. So it could be 2 times par, a fixed number like 10, or a net double bogey, something like that. And this was a new form of play for 2019, and it's a nice form of play in that it allows individual stroke play among a great number of players, but without necessarily the drudgery of everybody having to hole out on every single hole. And we'll see that's a common theme with the forms of stroke play we'll look at here. Next is par and bogey, whose definition is on page 353. Again, a form of stroke play, even though the scoring terms are as in match play. So players playing against a fixed target score set by the committee. So you're playing against a very steady opponent who, for example, pars every hole. So if you par the hole, you tie the hole. If you birdie it, you win. If you bogey it, you lose the hole. And the competitor or the player who wins the competition is the player who does the best overall. So in a par competition, it could be that the best that is done is a player who finishes the round or the quote unquote match 3 down. That even though that person didn't beat Mr. Parr, he still did better than the humans he was playing against. Next, Stableford. On page 360. Another form of stroke play, whereas score for holes based on points awarded by comparing the score by comparing the number of strokes against a fixed target score set by the committee. Competitions won by the player or side who earns the most points. Again, a nice form of play where, as we'll see, a player does not necessarily have to hole out on every hole, which as a result helps pace of play. Last definition is 3-ball on page 363, which is a form of match play where you have 3 players, each playing an individual match against the other 2, and each player plays 1 ball that's used in both of their matches. So let's say, for example, Phil, Dan, and I are playing a 3-ball match. And what that means is Phil and I have an individual match between ourselves. Dan and I have an individual match, and Phil and Dan have an individual match. And as we'll see, the most important thing to keep in mind with a three-ball match play is that each match is separate from the one you're playing. So, and that can matter with certain rules situations that arise. So back to Rule 21. Purpose of the rule. This rule covers 4 other forms of individual play, including 3 forms of stroke play, where the scoring is different. Maximum score, Stableford, and par and bogey, and then also another form of match play. First, let's look at Stableford. We just talked about this is a format where it's based on points, where you compare the player's score versus the target score for the hole set by the committee. The winner is the one who earns the most points. You can play it on a scratch basis or in a net basis. Now, how points are awarded. And we have the nice chart, but notice it does, in a helpful way, give us a default position saying that, hey, if a committee does not say so, par is the fixed target score, but certainly a committee could change things. So as we see with using the example of par as the fixed target score, if a player makes a par, they earn 2 points for that hole. If a player makes double bogey or worse, player earns 0 points. So again, a large part of the appeal of Stableford is if let's say it's a par 4 and you're already lie 5 and you're not in the hole, you might as well pick up because you're not going to earn any points for the hole. And again, that is part of the genius, in that way you can still have a large individual stroke play competition, but not have necessarily a horrendous pace of play, because players do not have to hole out. Now, if a player doesn't hole out, player simply gets 0 points for that hole. So whether the player plays into the hole and makes a double bogey or triple bogey, or just picks up, the result's going to be the same, 0 points. And as the rule says, players are actually encouraged to pick up when they reach that point. All right, now scoring in terms of the scorecard. Now, if the player does hole out, if the score would result in points being awarded, the scorecard must show the score, number of strokes made. You know, it's the score. The scorecard should not just show how many points the marker believes the player earned. Now, if the score would result in 0 points, Then for that hole, the scorecard just needs to indicate either no score, so it's okay to leave it blank, or any score that results in 0 points being awarded. So for example, if on one hole, for some reason, I'm very stubborn, I go ahead and finish hole out for a 10, but my marker, and let's say it's a par 4, puts me down for a 6, that's okay, because either way, I'm not going to earn any points for that hole. That even though the score on there is lower than what I actually made, it's not lower than actually made in a way that would affect how many points I would earn. So the players still need to put down their scores. The committee is responsible for calculating how many points the player gets for each hole in a handicap competition, applying the handicap strokes, which is a large chore for the committee in the handicap Stableford competition. Lots of math. Is that right, Jeff?
Oh, we rely on the computer. But yeah,
And a lot of math, but nothing that a good software program will help. So there we see on page 284, the illustration of the scorecard and who is responsible for what. We'll see the player needs to have the gross number of strokes made, the 2 signatures, and then the committee is responsible for applying any handicap and determining number of points earned. All right, so penalties in Stableford. Well, in general, penalties apply in stroke play as they do in Stableford. So let's say a player breaches rule 8.1a, doing something that improves the area of his intended swing, then he would just add the 2 penalty strokes that he would get. And who knows, he might still be able to earn a point for the hole, but there is a fair chance that might mean he will earn no points, but he'll just go ahead and add those penalty strokes as if they incurred. But in these 5 situations where normally a player in stroke play is disqualified, in Stableford, instead of being disqualified, the player simply earns 0 points for the hole, such as failing to hole out, playing from outside the teeing area and not correcting that mistake, playing a wrong ball and not correcting that mistake, committing a serious breach of playing from a wrong place and not correcting that mistake, and not correcting the mistake of playing in the wrong order in foursomes play. Now, if the player breaches any other rule with a penalty of disqualification, the player would still be disqualified. So an example of that would be, let's say a player makes a stroke with a non-conforming club. That player would still be disqualified. Now, after applying any penalty strokes, it's important to keep in mind that the Stableford score cannot be lower than 0 points. So in that regard, it's a very positive form of play, and can be, it's especially a great form of play for those who are perhaps new to the game. Exception to 11.2. Remember, 11.2 deals with the deliberate deflection of a ball in motion. That does not apply in this situation. We've seen something similar in match play, and that is if a player has 1 stroke left to earn 1 point and somebody deliberately deflects or stops the ball when there is no reasonable chance it can be holed, there's no penalty to that person, the player gets 0 points for the hole. So I'm putting for a bogey 5 on a par 4, hoping to make it and get 1 point. Hit it too hard, ball's past the hole, rolling downhill away from the hole, and Jeff just knocks the ball back to me. There would be no penalty to either of us, and I simply get 0 points for the hole. When the round ends in Stableford, when the player holes out on their final hole, or perhaps chooses not to hole out on the final hole. So that is Stableford, a very good form of play, and one that's perhaps underused and underappreciated. Maximum score. Rule 21.2. We saw the definition. It's a form of stroke play. Scoring is as in normal stroke play, but the committee has set a maximum number of strokes for a hole. With one common example or application being 2 times par. So if a player has an awful hole on a par 3, he will simply make a 6 on that hole. Even if he never holes out, or even if he made an 8 on the hole, he will score 6. So again, this can help pace of play and help, as well as help people from getting too discouraged by the game. So it's written so it can be in a scratch competition or a handicap competition, can be individual play or a partnership form of play. Scoring. Players score for holes based on the number of strokes, except the player will get only the maximum score, even if the actual score exceeds that maximum. So if the maximum score is 2 times par on a par 3, and I make 7, my score for that hole will be 6. A player who does not hole out gets the maximum score. And to help pace of play, again, just as in Stableford, players are encouraged to pick up when they have reached that maximum. Now, the scorecard. If the player does hole out and that score is lower than the maximum score, then the scorecard naturally must show the actual score. Now, if the score is the same or higher than the maximum, then the scorecard needs to show either no score for that hole or any score at or above the maximum. So again, using the par 3 example with 6 as the maximum score, if the scorecard would either show no score for that hole, which is fine, or any score of 6 or higher, regardless of what the player made for the hole. Now, if the player does not hole out, then the same would apply, either no score or any score at or above the maximum. Now, the committee is responsible for adjusting the player's score to the maximum for any hole and applying handicaps. Now, penalties, just as we saw in Stableford, that, in general, the player would apply penalties as they normally would in regular stroke play. But in these 5 cases, there is no penalty of disqualification, same as we saw in Stableford, such as failing to hole out and failing to correct certain mistakes. Any other breach with the penalty of disqualification would still result in disqualification. Same exception for Rule 11.2, that if the player's ball in motion needs to be holed to score 1 lower than the maximum score. So if it's again, the par 3 example, maximum score of 6, if I am putting for a 4, this exception does not apply. It applies only when I'm putting for a 5. And if someone deliberately deflects or stops that ball when there's no reasonable chance it can be holed, no penalty, and player gets the maximum score for that hole. Now on to 21.3 and par and bogey. So the important thing is, even though we keep score as in match play, that this is a form of stroke play, meaning, among other things, that there are no concessions. And the player will play against a fixed target score for each hole set by the committee. Most often it would be par. So again, just imagine you're playing a very steady opponent who simply pars every hole, and you need to see how you can fare against that person, sometimes with handicap strokes, sometimes without. So how holes are won and lost. Scoring is done as in match play, holes being won or lost by comparing the number of strokes taken to the fixed score set by the committee. So let's say it's a par competition. First hole, par 4, I make a bogey, I lose the hole, I'm 1 down. Next hole, a par 3, I make a birdie. Now I won that hole, so my match against Mr. Par is tied. Now, if the player's score is lower than the fixed score, the player will win the hole. If it's the same as the fixed score, the hole is tied. And if it's higher, then the player loses the hole. Now, again, just as we saw with Stableford maximum score, a player does not necessarily have to hole out So if a player reaches the point where he knows he can't tie a hole, let's say it's a par 3 and I already lie 3, then I'm encouraged to pick up, because I am, whether I hold the next stroke or hole out in 3 more strokes, I'm still going to lose the hole. So the result's the same. For the sake of pace of play, I should just pick up and keep going. Now with the scorecard, similar to what we saw in other forms of play, if the player holds out and the score results in the hole being won or tied, then the scorecard needs to show the actual score for that hole. Now, if the player would have lost the hole, then either the scorecard must have either no score for that hole or any score that results in the hole being lost. So if it's a par 3 and I made a 4 or worse, then the scorecard needs to have either no score for that hole or any score of 4 or greater that would let the committee reach the conclusion that I lost that hole. Because the committee is ultimately responsible for tallying things up and deciding whether the player won, lost, or tied each hole, as well as applying handicaps. But notice for this form of play, there is an exception. For the scorecard, if the player returns a scorecard with a hole lower than the actual score, but this does not affect the outcome of that hole, then there is no penalty. So let's say, for example, on a par 3 hole, I made a birdie, and for some reason, scorecard returned a score of 1 for the hole, maybe just to get the committee's attention and see if it noticed. That's okay, because the actual score I made, a 2, earned me a win for that hole. So whether I actually got a 1 or a 2, the result is the same. I won the hole. Penalties, we'll see the same. Normally apply penalties as you would in regular stroke play. In these 5 cases, there is no disqualification. It just means that the player would lose the hole in question, such as if the player did not hole out, or if the player committed a serious breach of playing from wrong place and did not correct that mistake. Rule 11.22, similar exception with a very narrow set of circumstances. If I'm putting to tie the hole, let's say I'm putting for par, and I hit it beyond the hole too hard, and Jim deliberately deflects my ball to knock it back to me as a courtesy, there's no penalty to either of us, and I simply lose the hole. All right, so now let's shift gears a little bit and move into match play with a 3-ball match play. And remember, this is where 3 players and each player is playing an individual match against each of the other 2 players. And for emphasis, let's just take a look at clarification 21.4/1 on page 291, just for emphasis of the separate nature of the matches being played. In 3-ball match play, because each player is playing 2 distinct matches, situations may arise that affect one match but not the other. And as I said, that's the most single important point to keep in mind when dealing with 3-ball match play. For example, player A concedes the next stroke, a hole, or the match to player B. That concession has no effect on the match between A and C or the match between B and C. So back to the 3-ball match where Phil, Dan, and I are playing, that if I tell Phil, hey, Phil, that 2-foot putt is good, that only applies to the match between Phil and me. It does not apply to the match between Phil and Dan. That Dan may well want Phil to go ahead and putt that 2-footer. So what does that mean? That means Phil needs to be careful, right? In terms of whether he lifts that ball. Before he lifts it, he should look to Dan and say, Dan, is this good also? The rules for match play apply to all the individual matches. Let me see, playing out of turn. And this can get a little tricky, since you have several different matches going on. If a player plays out of turn in any match, the opponent who should have played first may cancel the stroke under Rule 6. If the player played out of turn in both matches, then each opponent may choose whether to cancel the stroke with the player. Player's stroke is canceled in only one match. The player must continue with the original ball in the other match, which means that this is one case where in match play, your player may actually be playing two different balls. But it's important to note that while he's playing two balls, he's only playing one ball in each match. Ball or ball marker lifted by an opponent. If an opponent gets a penalty stroke for lifting a player's ball or ball marker, that penalty applies only in the match with that player. So if I lift or move, let's say I move Phil's ball and I get a penalty stroke for that, that applies only in that match, because what I did with Phil's ball has nothing to do with my match against Dan. So in my match against Dan, there would be no penalty. So that's a case where I could wind up with two different scores on that hole. It could be a 5 in my match against Phil and a 4 in my match against Dan. Rule 21.5, other forms of playing golf. Certainly, on a daily basis around the country and around the world, there are a number of competitions played using, especially, say, the scramble format. And here the rules say, it's up to the committee to do their best to adapt the rules to these forms of play. And in the committee procedures offers a little bit of guidance with that. So that is Rule 21. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So on to 22. These next two rules deal with partnership forms of play. And Rule 22 deals with foursomes, also known as alternate shot. In foursomes, you can play in either match play or stroke play, certainly popular among the international team competitions we see, whether it's the Walker Cup, Curtis Cup, Ryder Cup, President's Cup, Solheim Cup. But a really tough form of play is stroke play foursomes, because that's how you learn how good a relationship you have with your partner, because that puts a lot of stress on things. When your partner's playing your poor shots, your errant shots. Rule 22 covers foursomes where two partners compete together as a side by alternating and making strokes at a single ball. The rules for this form of play are essentially the same as for individual play, except for requiring the partners to alternate and teeing off to start a hole and to play out each hole with alternate shots. So, the common form of play is, let's say Jeff and I are partners that will decide, who's going to play from the odd tees, who will play from the even numbered tees. And then there's some strategy involved with that, such as if Jeff's the better iron player and 3 of the par 3s are odd numbered holes, maybe he should tee off on the odd numbered holes, various things like that. So 22.1, the overview, we talk about playing alternately. We also talk about that there is a form of match play. Can't be stroke play because it's uneven, but match play known as threesomes, where an individual competes against the side of two partners who will play alternately. Something that you don't see that often, but sometimes, can be a good way to play. For example, sometimes you come across a course, perhaps overseas, that only allow 2 balls for certain times of the day, but you have 3 players. Well, one thing you can do is play a threesome, which is a form of 2 balls, as 2 balls are being played, and just change sides every 6 holes. Rule 22.2, either partner may act for the side. Either partner may take any action, any allowed action for the side before the stroke is made, such as marking, ball, lifting, replacing, dropping, regardless of whose turn it is to play next. So that makes things nice and simple. A partner and their caddy may help the other partner in any way that the other partner's caddy is allowed to help. So in other words, if my caddy is allowed to do something, then that means my partner Jeff and his caddy may do the same thing, such as giving and asking for advice, but must not give any help that the other partner's caddy is not allowed to give under the rules. Any action taken or breach the rules by either partner or caddy applies to the side, because remember, the side's only going to have one score for the hole. So that means any penalty applies to that single score. And in stroke play, at the end of the round with a scorecard, only one of the two partners has to certify the hole scores. 22.3, the main, as we've said, the distinguishing feature of foursomes is the alternate shot nature of it. So what happens if the players do not play alternately? Well, they must alternate the order in which they play first from the teen area of each hole. After the side's first stroke, the partners must alternate strokes for the rest of the hole. So if I hit the tee shot on hole 1, then Jeff hits the second shot, I hit the third shot, and so forth. If a stroke is canceled, replayed, or otherwise does not count, the same partner who made the stroke must make the next stroke for the side. If the side decides to play a provisional ball, it must be played by the partner whose turn is to play the side's next stroke. So, for example, let's say I hit a tee shot out of bounds, and we know it's out of bounds. Then we know then it would then be Jeff's turn to play, because penalty strokes do not affect the order of play. So therefore, it'd follow that if we know the ball is out of bounds and Jeff would play next, that if we decide to play a provisional ball, that Jeff would be the one to play that provisional ball. So penalty for playing in the incorrect order is the general penalty. So in match play, it's straightforward, it's loss of hole. In stroke play, it's more involved. This is one of the situations where the side must correct the mistake or be disqualified. So in stroke play, if the players play an incorrect sequence, for example, I hit the tee shot and I hit the second shot, then the right partner must make a stroke from where the side made the first stroke in the wrong order. And the stroke made in the wrong order, and any subsequent strokes don't count. And if we don't correct this mistake before starting the next hole, we are disqualified. Rule 22.4, starting the round. The partner to play first. The side may choose which partner will play from the first teen area and starting the round, unless the terms of the condition say which partner must play first. And generally, this happens, as best I know, mainly in mixed foursomes, where they say, in part for safety reasons and pace of play reasons, that the males play from the odd numbered holes and the females play from the even numbered holes, or vice versa. The sides round starts when that partner makes a stroke to start the side's first hole. Now, how about starting time? Since we know that only one player is going to play from the first tee, how do you decide if the side has fulfilled the starting time requirements? Well, the partner who will play first must be ready to play at the starting time and starting point, and must start at that time. So if it's an 8 o'clock tee time off number 1, then, and let's say Jeff is playing the odd numbered holes, Jeff needs to be there at 8 o'clock. Now, what about me? Where do I need to be? The partner who will play second must be present at the starting time, either at the starting point, so at the first teen area, or on the hole near where the ball played from the teen area is expected to come to rest. So if I want to go ahead and get a head start and wander down the first fairway toward the landing area, that is okay. And that's one of the reasons that's why it's so interesting that foursomes play. If done properly, a foursome can play more quickly than two single players can. Because by the time say Jeff will have reached the fairway, I could have already played the second shot. And then Jeff just keeps on walking right up to the green without stopping. So it can be a very quick form of play when done efficiently like that. Partners may share clubs as long as the total number between the two of them is not more than 14. Now, restriction on players standing behind partner when the stroke is made. So in addition to what we covered under Rule 10, the player must not stand on or close to an extension of the line of play behind the ball while their partner is making the stroke to gain information for the side's next stroke. And we'll see something similar in Rule 23, and it probably has a little more application in Rule 23, and Dan will cover that there. So any questions on Rule 22 with foursomes?
I have
Yeah.
a question about
Okay.
when a hole starts in foursome stroke play and in four ball stroke play,
Okay.
particularly if there's a situation where a player who has yet to play on a hole discovers that he has 15 clubs in his bag. There's a clarification that talks about four ball match play, that once a hole is started, whoever hits, that hole is started, but if you haven't hit yet, you're only gonna have the match adjustment will occur on that hole, but you won't get the penalty for that hole, only the hole before, because you haven't teed off yet. But if it's four ball or foursome stroke play, when is that player, even if he hasn't hit yet, is he still, are they liable for that hole with their partner?
Okay. So the question is that, let's say Jeff and I are partners, and Jeff is teeing off on the first hole, and Jeff tees off, and then I realize I have too many clubs in my bag. Is that I have 15 clubs? Is that the question? Well, in that case, then the round for both of us has already started. So I and therefore the side would be penalized in that case for too many clubs. And as you said, that's, four ball play can be a little bit different with that. But in this case, the key is that, the nature of the two of us playing just one ball. Okay, if nothing else, let's see, do we want to keep going or take a little bit of a break?
Take a little break
Take a break, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
What's the answer for?
We'll take a 15-minute break and return with 23.
Purposely not answer the phone. All right, we're back at it. We're gonna cover Rule 23, which is four ball. There's only one definition, and that's the definition of four ball. But since it's in the overview, we'll cover it that way rather than the specific definition. Four ball, purpose of the rule. Rule 23 covers four ball played in either match play or stroke play, where partners compete at a side with each playing a separate ball. The side score for a hole is the lower score of the partners on that hole. This is considered by most people to be the most common form of play when four people go out and play golf. they play four ball. They may call it best ball, they may call it something else, but this is what they are playing. Overview of four ball. Four ball is a form of play, and it's either match play or stroke play involving partners. Two partners compete as a side, with each player playing their own ball. The side score for the hole is the lower score of the two partners on that hole. Rules 1 through 20 apply to this form of play, but as modified by the rules that we're going to go over. A variation of this form of match play known as best ball, where an individual player competes against a side of 2 or 3 partners, and each partner play their own ball. So an example of that is often you have the better player saying, I will play a match and I will play against the best ball of players B and C. So you have one side always player A, and the other side either B or C. The lower score will be counted. All right, 23.2 scoring in four ball. This is very simple, very straightforward. When both partners hole out or otherwise complete the hole, the lower score counts. If only one partner holes out, that score counts. And if neither partner holes out, we got a problem. And if it's match play, then it's a loss of hole. But if it's stroke play, you're going to be disqualified. Why? Because you have no score for that hole, and in stroke play, you have to have a score for the hole. 23.2b side score, scorecard in stroke play, side's responsibility. The side's gross score for each hole must be entered on a single scorecard. For each hole, the gross score of at least one partner must be entered. There is no penalty for entering more than one partner. And this is the key. Each score in the scorecard must be clearly identified as a score of each player. So if you look at the scorecard on the next page, you see Kate and John, and you see that they have clearly indicated that on the fourth hole, the 4 was scored by Kate, not John. If the scorecard just has a 4 at the bottom, where it says side score, and no indication of who scored it, that would not be a correct scorecard, and they would be disqualified if it's not corrected. The WSGA events, we don't have paper scorecards. At least I don't think we do anymore. So you're going to enter on your phone, and it's very difficult to understand how you could put it halfway between two people on an electronic device. So Kate's going to recover a 4 in the first hole. John's going to be a 5. And then the computer is going to say side scores. Only one partner needs to certify the whole scores. Again, if you have a paper scorecard, that means you'd only need one signature. When you have electronic scoring, what that means is that once the scores are verified, there is a system where you push a button, and that is the certification that the scores are correct. Committee responsibility. The committee is responsible for deciding which scores count for each side on each hole, including applying any handicaps. If only one score is entered for a hole, the score counts for the side. If the score of both players are entered for a hole, if the scores are different, the lowest gross score for that hole counts. If both scores are the same, the committee may count either score. If the score used is found to be wrong for any reason, the committee will count the other score. Notice that last sentence does not apply to when the scores are different. Let's look at clarification 23.2b2. It's on page 306. So let's start with the third bullet point down. Player A returns a score of 4, and player B, the partner, returns a score of 5. Player A was in breach of 12.2b1 for touching sand in the bunker, a practice swing in a bunker, but neither partner was aware of the penalty before it was returned. The exception to 3.3b3 applies. As players A's score was the score that counts, the committee must apply the penalty to player A's score on that hole. Therefore, the side score for the hole is 6, The rules only allow the side to revert to player B's score if both partners' scores were the same on the hole. I find this to be a rather strange rule, but it's clear that that is what the rule says. So if you have two scores and then it's found out that one has a penalty, two scores are the same, you can revert to the other one. If one is higher and one is lower, you stick with the lower, and if they get a later penalty, that score is actually going to count, even though it's higher than the other one.
Which, what was that clarification number then? 23, right? Could be good.
Going back, where was, okay. If the score that counts for the side is not clearly identified as the score of the individual partner who made it, or if the partner is disqualified relating to the play of that hole, the side is disqualified. So again, looking at the scorecard on page 299, on the fourth hole, John does not enter a score. If Kate is disqualified for some reason, then they have no score, and the team is the four ball is disqualified. 23.2C, John has gone over this at least 3 times, perhaps 4 times. This is the Jordan Spieth exception. This means that if you have to make the putt to count for the score and it doesn't go in, and the ball rolls past the hole, even though it is still in motion, someone else can pick it up and throw it back, no penalty. 23.3, when round starts and ends when hole is completed. These are administrative things, and they become important when there's a question of whether some penalty should apply. It only applies during the round, and you have to know when the round started. A side's round starts when one of the partners makes a stroke to start their hole. When the round ends, a side's round ends in match play when either side has won the match, or the match is tied after the final hole when the terms of the competition say that the match may end in a tie. In stroke play, when the side completes the final hole, either by the partner holing out or by one of the partners holing out on the final hole and the other partner choosing not to. When the hole is completed, match play. A side has completed the hole when both partners have holed out or had their next stroke conceded. One partner has holed out or had their next stroke conceded, and the other partner chooses not to. The result of the hole is decided, such as when the other side's score for the hole is lower, meaning if the other side's got a 3 and you're putting for a 4 and your partner's putting for a 4, the hole has been completed. 23.4, very interesting rule. One partner may represent the side on any hole or all of the holes or some of the holes. The side may be represented by one partner during all or part of the round. It's not necessary for both partners to be present, or if present for both to play in each hole. If a partner is absent and then arrives to play, the partner may start play for the side only between the play of 2 holes, which means, and we're going to go over these, but the point is you can't join during a hole. And one of the reasons why you can't is because the strategy is so much different in match play between what you think who you got to beat and whether the partner is there or just one person is there. In match play, before any player in match play starts a hole, if the partner arrives only after any player on either side in the match has started play of the hole, that partner is not allowed to play for the side until the next hole. So in a match, you have A, B playing C, D. As soon as one of those 4 players tees off, the hole is started, and the one who is missing cannot join at that point. Stroke play before other partner starts the hole. So again, you have A, B playing a group, C, D playing a group. The difference in stroke play is they're not playing against each other. It's not a match. You're playing against the field. So it makes no difference to A, B whether side CD has only one partner there or has two partners there. The point is they have to compete against all the other partner combinations, not just CD. So their strategy would presumably in stroke play be just to get the lowest score, and you wouldn't necessarily try and beat just the group you're playing against. An arriving partner who is not allowed to play may still give advice or help to the other partner. Why? Because they're still considered a partner. This rule simply doesn't allow you to play during that hole, but you can still give advice. Penalty for making a stroke we're not allowed to play in breach is the general penalty. 23.20, let's look at clarification 23.4/1. It's on the top of 307. Determining handicap allowance in match play if one player unable to compete. If in a 4-ball match played under handicap, the player with the lowest handicap is unable to play. The absent player is not disregarded, given that they may start play for the side between the play of two holes, which in match play means only before one player or the side has started the hole. What is the reason for this? The reason for this is a player that is not there doesn't have to play in that hole. You may actually not show up until the 17th hole. If you've disregarded the handicap of the lower player, what do you do when that player actually does show up? So what this clarification is saying is, if it's AB playing against CD and A is the best player and you would normally be playing off of their handicap and they are not there, you still consider A to be there and you still use his handicap for purposes of deciding what the other people's handicap should be. All right, 23.5. Players allowed to take any action concerning the partner's ball that partner may take. Although each player on a side must play their own ball, a player may take any action concerning the partner's ball that the partner is allowed to take before making a stroke, such as to mark the spot, lift, replace, drop. So if you hit your ball into a penalty area and you have to play it, your partner can then drop it if you want them to. A player and the partner's caddy may help the partner in any way that the partner's caddy is allowed to help, such as to give and be asked for advice and take other actions, but must not give any help that the partner's caddy is not allowed under the rules. The way to think of this is you got the partner, and sometimes they're referred to as affiliates, but the three other people, you have the partner, the partner's caddy, the player's caddy, and then you have the player. So what we're talking about here is these four people are going to be treated as if it is done by the partner. In stroke play, the partners must not agree with each other to leave a ball in place on the putting green to help either of them or any other player. This is not a rule that's really specific to 23.5. This refers you to 15.3, simply saying you can't leave a helping ball in place. 23.5b, partner is responsible for player's actions. Any action taken by the player concerning the partner's ball or equipment is treated as have been taken by the partner. If the player's action would breach a rule if taken by the partner is in breach and gets the penalty. And then it goes through some examples. So if you're walking down the fairway, you kick your partner's ball, you do not get a penalty. However, your partner gets the penalty because you have moved the partner's ball. Similarly, that's the second point there. Improving the conditions affecting the stroke. So you, before your partner hits, you go and improve the line of play. You don't get the penalty, your partner gets the penalty because it's your partner's ball. This also applies to action by the player's caddy concerning the partner's ball that would be a breach if taken by the partner or the caddy. The actions of the player or the player's caddy that affect the play of both the player's ball and the partner's ball. We're going to go over this. There's a reference there to 23.9A2. We're going to go over that shortly. 23.6, sides order of play. The point to keep in mind here is order of play is not determined by a particular partner. It is the side that controls the order of play. So if either of AB's ball is further from the hole than either of CD's ball, then side AB has the order of play. Once having decided that side AB has the order of play, then either A or B can play in whichever order they decide. So you can have a situation where AB decides that they want B to play first, B goes up, take his stance, and CD complains that you're standing on their line of play. Well, that's life. AB gets to decide how they want to play, and on they go. There's an exception here for continuing the play of a hole after stroke conceded in match play. And an example of this is A is on the putting green 30 feet from the hole, and his partner B is 4 feet from the hole directly on his line, and B is putting for a 7, and A is putting for 3. Side CD then says, okay, we're going to concede player B's next stroke, so you pick it up, you get a 7. If player B then continues the play of the hole, which then helps the partner's score cannot count. So in that situation, the side's score would be a 7. A, in my example, 30 feet away, would not have the opportunity to putt for a birdie. 23.7. Partners may share clubs. 4.1B2 is modified to allow players to share clubs so long as the total number of clubs they have together is not more than 14. This often causes some confusion because people don't read the rule literally. It says, and they have together is not more than 14 clubs. So if one has 7 and one has 6, they have together more than 14 clubs. Remember, the rule is you cannot share clubs. That's the rule. This is an exception. If you want to come under the exception, you have to come under the wording of the exception. Someone asked me a question the other day, if one of them has 13 clubs, the other has 13 clubs, and they agreed between them that they will share one driver, doesn't each of them then have 14 clubs? Well, they may each have 14 clubs, but they can't share because together they have more than 14 clubs. That's the way you read that rule. 23.8, this is a new addition to the rules. Restrictions on player standing behind partner when stroke made. In addition to the limitations in 10.2b4, a player must not stand on or close to an extension of the line of play behind the ball while their partner is making the stroke to gain information for the player's next stroke. When it says to gain information, you have to read that to say for the purpose of gaining information. What this says is, if a player stands behind their partner, all of the rule 10.2b stuff applies. And if there's going to be a penalty, it's always going to be applied to the player that is putting, not the player that's standing behind. This is an exception. This applies to the player who is actually standing behind. And again, this is in addition to the prohibitions on 10.2b4.
So they would both get a penalty.
They would only both get a penalty if the player was standing behind the partner, and by standing there, they breach 10.2b4. And remember, 10.2b4, John went over this, has been substantially changed for 2023, and there is no prohibition Let me rephrase that. You can stand in the restricted area as long as you don't do one of the bad things that you can't do in 10.2B4, which is to help with aiming or to help with other specific reasons. What this is saying is, in addition to all of that stuff, now you can't stand behind the player to gain information for your next stroke. What I don't understand about this rule is it only prohibits the player from standing behind. It does not prohibit the player from doing what any normal person would do, is they'd go on the other side of the hole and they'd watch the putt and they see which way it breaks. That's permissible. What you can't do is you can't stand directly behind in the restricted area.
So to Phil's question, do both player and partner get the general penalty?
The question is, do both players get the general penalty? And the answer is, you don't know until you know whether the player that was standing behind his partner was in breach of 10.2B4. If he was, then the player who is putting is going to get the penalty, and the player standing behind is only going to get a penalty if he's standing there to gain information. So you have to analyze both of those. So you could have a situation where they're standing behind in which neither gets the penalty. You could have a situation where one of them gets a penalty, and you could have a situation where both of them. 23.9. When a player gets a penalty for breach of a rule, the penalty may apply either to that player alone or to both partners, that is, to the side. This depends on the penalty and the form of play. So 23.9A is talking about penalties other than disqualifications. Okay, this is your standard 1 or 2 stroke penalties. When a partner gets a penalty other than disqualification, that penalty normally applies only to the player and not also to their partner, except in what we're going to go over in just a minute. Any penalty strokes are added only to the player's score, not to the partner's score. In match play, a player who gets the general penalty has no score and can count for the side and the hole, but this penalty has no effect on the partner who may continue to play for the hole. Obvious examples, you're playing, you hit your ball out of bounds. You get a 1-stroke penalty, your partner does not get a 1-stroke penalty. If you don't finish the hole, you are, in match play, you're going to get the loss of hole penalty, but your partner can still score and carry on. All right, these are the 3 exceptions. 3 situations where the player's penalty also applies to the partner. And when you look at these 3, the first 2 bullet points apply in both stroke play and match play. The last bullet point applies only in match play. So let's look at the first one, and this is the magic 4.1B. We have talked about this. Anytime you consider the 4.1B penalty, the red flag should go up if you're taking the national exam, because this is the oddball with the rules. This is a situation in match play, the side gets the penalty, the adjustment penalty, and in stroke play, the partner also gets the same penalty. So you're playing the hole on the 15th hole, you discover that your partner has 15 clubs. What does that mean? Well, in match play, it's an adjustment penalty. So if it's match play 4-ball and you were 3 holes up, you're now magically 1 hole up. If it was in stroke play, then the player, each of the 2 players, A and B, are going to get 2 strokes, a total of 4 strokes, and it's going to be on the hole where the breach first occurred, which if they started with 15 clubs and you discovered on the 15th hole, that means the penalty is applied to hole 1 and hole 2. When players breach helps partners play, in either match play or stroke play, the partner also gets the penalty. Let's look at 23.9A21. This is on page 309. Examples of when players breach helps partners play. Bullet point number 1 here. When side AB playing side CD, player B's ball is near the hole and in a position to help player A aim their putt. Player C, the opponent, requires player B to mark and lift B's ball. Player B declines to lift the ball and player A putts. Player B gets the general penalty under 15.3A. Why? Because he was requested to lift his ball. He failed to do so. Since this helped player A also gets the general penalty. That's because the breach helped the opponent. Helped the partner, excuse me. The last situation in match play, when players breach hurts the opponent's play. This is almost going to, not always, but a common example would be when you give the wrong number of strokes. So let's look at that example. That is on page 310. It's clarification 23.9A2, parent 2. Examples of when players breach hurts an opponent. For example, side A and B are playing side CD in a 4-ball match. Player A provides the wrong number of strokes they have taken to either C or D, while all 4 players are in contention. Side CD based its strategy on this information, and one of them makes a stroke. So by giving the wrong number of strokes, you have hurt the opponent. If you've hurt the opponent, then the side is going to get the penalty. So an example of this is assuming that it's a long, difficult par 5, and everybody's on the green and they're looking at one another and they say, well, boy, how'd you guys all get here? A, B, what did you have? And A says, well, I'm here in 4, and B says, I'm here in 4, and C and D say, well, they're here in 3. Now they're basing the strategy on it. If it turns out that A really wasn't there in 4, but he was there in 5, then the side's going to lose the hole. There is an exception. We won't go over it, but it depends on, and it's the next clarification. If you give the wrong number of strokes and you are not in contention, then it's not going to have it's not considered to have hurt the opponents because they're not basing their strategy on. So in the example that I gave, A and B are on the green. They're asked what they're lying. A says he's lying 3. B says he's lying 6. Turns out B is actually lying 7. B is really not in contention for that hole. So the fact that he gave that wrong information is irrelevant. All right, so those are the 3 situations in which both players are going to get the penalty. And here's the exception. Player who makes stroke at wrong ball is not treated as having helped partners play or hurt opponents play. This sounds bizarre, but this is the rule. Prior to 2019, this was a decision, it was not part of the rules. And the rules simply said if you help your partner, you're going to get disqualified. And then there would be this decision that said, however, if you play your partner's ball as a wrong ball, it's not going to be considered helping. It is now for 2019, it's now put into the rule itself, and it says only the player, not the partner, gets the general penalty. This is true whether the ball played as a wrong ball belongs to the partner, an opponent, or anyone else. I once heard David Stabler comment that it was good that this was now in the rules and that it was going to be on every national test he ever writes until people understand what this is. So there you go. If you take the national exam, you know what one of the questions is going to be, and you're going to get it right as long as you understand that if you play your player's ball, it is not treated as having helped the partner's play. Last section of 23.9B, disqualification penalties. And we're going to go over these. There's a distinction between part 1 and part 2. Part 1, when breached by one partner means the side is disqualified. So if one partner breaches any of this laundry list, and there's about 20 items, the side is going to be disqualified. What do these all have in common? Well, the first couple are spirit of the game rules, standards of conduct, playing by the rules. The next 5 or 6 are the potential advantage is too great. Someone plays a non-conforming club. How do you decide whether their score should or should not count? And then the last ones on the top of the next page are fundamental player responsibilities, certifying whole score and so forth. The way I remember these is not to remember the ones that are going to disqualify the side, but to look at parent 2, and these are the ones that if one partner gets, it means that only one partner gets the penalty and the side is not disqualified. So when parent 2 says when breach by both partners means side is disqualified, I think of this instead as when breach by one partner means side is not disqualified. So each of these next 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 items has to do with the fact that if a partner does any of those 8 or 9 items, the side's not going to be disqualified, only the partner. So what do they have in common? Parent 2, those next 4 all deal with 5, 5.3, 5.4, 5.6a, 5.6c. All of those have to do with a situation where one of the partners is not playing. We know from Rule 23.4 that one partner may always represent the side. So these 4 rules, if you are disqualified for not representing the side, the partner isn't going to be disqualified. The side isn't going to be disqualified. Why? Because the partner can always play by himself, as dictated by 23.4. The last 5 items, if you look at those carefully, those are basically the must corrects or report to the committee. So you take the first one, 3.3c, failure to hold out. Happens all the time in 4-ball. Someone doesn't hold out. Is the side disqualified? No. Same thing if you play a wrong ball. Same thing if you fail to report the playing of 2 balls. It only applies to that one player. The reason the heading says when a side is disqualified if at the same hole both partners get the penalty, what they're simply saying is if on hole number 3 neither partner holes out, well, you don't have a score. If you don't hole out and you're playing stroke play, you don't have a score. The last section, when breached by one player, means the player has no valid score for a hole. It says in all other situations, so you got to figure out there's a rule where someone's going to get disqualified and it's not one of the 30 listed. And the player breaches the rule with a penalty of disqualification. The player is not disqualified, but the player's score on the hole where the breach happened cannot count for the side. What's an example of that? I don't know. Under the old rules, it used to be the failure to report rules. John went over the change in 2023 for Stableford and maximum score and no longer the need to report to the committee. So I don't know what would fall under that, possibly a local rule. John, do you have any other wisdom?
Yeah, there are a few things that I had it figured out once and I've forgotten. But there are like 2 or 3 situations.
Right. So there are a couple, we just don't know what they are. Any questions on 23? Yeah.
If in a 4-ball match, one player gets to the course late, can't start playing until the beginning of the next hole, but before the beginning of the next hole occurs, can they practice putting on the green that the other players just left before they actually start playing?
I would say that the match has started when one of the players has started. The sides match has started. So that's 23.3, I believe it is. Yeah, 23.3, the size round has started. So since the size round has started, we then go to the practice rule, and there are two different things to consider. If your round hasn't started, you're allowed to practice in this way. If your round has started, you have to practice, you can practice in this way. One of the practice rules that allows you to practice is you can practice on or near the whole of the last green played. So if it's the last one, I would say yes.
Okay.
Any other questions on 23? No, okay. I'll do 24. It's a short rule. All right, rule 24, team competitions. Rule 24 covers team competitions. This is the purpose statement. Played in either match play or stroke play, where multiple players or sides compete as a team with the result of their rounds or matches combined to produce an overall team score. This is, when you think of Rule 24, this is the high school events, this is the NCAA college tournaments, and also would be things like the Ryder Cup and the Curtis Cup and so forth. A team is a group of players who play as individuals or as sides to compete against other teams. Their play in the team event may also be part of another competition, such as individual stroke play that takes place at the same time. Very common in a high school event to have individual winners and to have a team winner. At the NCAA level, I believe the format is still that they play 72 holes of stroke play. They then have an individual winner. The top 8 teams then go and they play single elimination match play. Terms of the team competition. The committee decides the form of play, how the team's overall score is to be calculated, and the other terms of the competition. In match play, the number of points awarded. In stroke play, the number of scores to count. It is fairly typical, at least in Wisconsin high schools, that if you're playing team events, you play 5 players and 4 players, the low 4 count. NCAA, it's the same. You play 5, the 4 low score counts. Could you set it up that only the low 2 count? Sure. And you'd also have to decide beforehand whether the competition may end in a tie and how the tie will be decided. One of the interesting things about the high school tournaments, I think it's the same way in the NCAAs, is if 2 teams tie for the low score, all 10 players go and play in a sudden death playoff. So you have a bizarre situation where you have 10 players playing the same hole. We had that in the high school, it must have been the high school girls last October. Team competition. Each team may name a team captain to lead the team and make decisions for it, such as which player on the team will play in which round or matches and in what order. The team captain may be a player in the competition. Generally in high school or college, the team captain is not a player. The team captain, so to speak, is the coach for the team. Advice allowed in competitions. 24 for a person allowed to give advice to team, also known as an advice giver. The committee may adopt a local rule allowing a team to name 1, cross out the word 1 and put 2 advice givers who may give advice and other help as allowed in Rule 10.2 to the players on the team during the round and who may be asked for advice. The advice giver may be a team captain, a team coach, or a person. The advice giver must be identified to the committee. This is done in the high school events, normally by a lanyard of some sort that says, here's the coach and here's the assistant coach. No one else can give advice but these 2 people. You'll notice the blue language. It says the committee procedures, H2. The committee may adopt a local rule allowing each team to name 2 advice givers. So the rule itself says you can adopt a local rule that allows 1 advice giver. Then you have the blue language that says they can adopt a local rule allowing 2 advice givers. I'm not sure why they didn't just change it to say 2 advice givers to begin with, but so be it. 24.4B. Restrictions on advice giver while playing. If a team's advice giver is playing on the team, they are not allowed to act in that role while playing a round in the competition. Again, this is not the case in a high school or NCAA. This would be perhaps in a competition where Blue Mound is playing against Merrill Hills in some sort of Ryder Cup type format, and you have a team captain. What they're saying is that the team captain cannot act as an advice giver while he's playing in that round. During the round, the advice giver is treated like any other player for purposes of help. In the last section, no advice between team members other than partners. Except when playing together as partners on the side, a player must not ask for advice from or give advice to a member of their team playing on the course. This is a tricky situation, especially when you have high school players. They may, as they often are, playing slowly. There's a backup on a par 3. The team gets there, and you have to be careful to caution them to make sure that they don't ask the player ahead of them, what are you going to hit on this par 3? That would be seeking advice, and you can't do it from somebody that is not a quote partner. Obviously, if they're playing a 4-ball type event, that partner could give advice, and so forth. The last part of 24 deals with an advice giver. Let me back up. Under the 2019 rules, a clarification was issued on what do you do when the coach, i.e. an advice giver, stands behind the player. The advice giver was not treated the same as a caddy. There was a separate rule on how you treat the advice givers. For 2023, advice givers are treated the same way as caddies for purposes of Rule 10.2B4. That is the standing behind. How do we know that? Because of the blue language on page 143 under the definition of under 10.2B4, it says in forms of play involving partners, advice givers, the player's partner, or the partner's caddy, and any advice giver are restricted in this same way. Fast forward now to 2023, we no longer have that clarification on when and where a coach can stand behind the player. It is the same as what a caddy can do. Example, the coach, for no reason at all, is standing behind the player. Is there a penalty? No, because you go back to 10.2B4, you're only going to get a penalty if you're standing in the restricted area and one of 2 things is happening. You're giving aiming help, or you're giving other specific help and you haven't moved away. But if you're simply standing behind your player and you're not giving them help with anything, there is no breach of this rule. I'm going to call your attention to one clarification. A player is not disqualified from the competition when their round does not count. It's in rule 1.3. The clarification is 1.3C/1. What that says in essence is if you're playing a high school event, you're playing an event and you have 2 separate rounds, if player A gets disqualified for round 1 for whatever reason, turning in a lower score than they're entitled, the player is not disqualified from the competition, meaning they can play the second day. Their score for the first day doesn't count and they're disqualified, but they can play on the second day. And that's Rule 24. Any questions? Yeah, Jim.
You said cross out 1, mark 2 for advice givers.
Well,
Just clarify.
that's how I would do it. And the reason it says is it says the committee may adopt a local rule allowing each team to name one person. Then you skip down to the blue language about 2 inches down, and it says the committee may adopt a local rule allowing each team to name 2 advice givers. So what does the committee do? It adopts a local rule that says we can name 2 advice givers. Could you have a local rule that says you can only name 1? Yes. But the point is you can have a local rule that allows 2. You can't have a local rule that allows 3.
Allows to all the way across the world, so. Wherever you do any tournaments in Wisconsin, you're gonna get.
Yes, I do have one. Looks like a second one came in, but the first one, it says. If a coach is identified as an outside agency, does that impact the application of penalties that might arise from a coach's actions?
I'm not sure what it means to say they are identified as an outside agency. First of all, outside agency doesn't exist. It's now called an outside influence. But I don't know how the player would be named an outside influence. I mean, they are going to be an outside influence. John, do you have a thought on that?
I'm not quite sure.
Maybe she will
Maybe she will clarify it.
clarify that a little bit. I'll let her have a moment to clarify that if she wants. The second one is basically asking the definition of the restricted area. If you could
Oh,
go over that.
yeah, again, the point of this is there is nothing in Rule 24 that deals with this. The reference is you have to look at 10(2)(b)(4), which is on page 142. John went over, but the restricted area is the caddy may not stand on or close to an extension of the line of play behind the player. This is the quote restricted area. The rest of this rule says this will apply, and the prohibitions on when the caddy cannot stand there apply to an advice giver under Rule 24. Showing once again that you can't read the rules by themselves. You got to know all 25 rules before you know any of the rules.
Getting back to question 1, she did clarify. She said the NCAA names them an outside influence on their advice policy. And she did say, oops, outside influence for 20.
If they're naming them as an outside influence, the only thing that I can think of is what that would mean is if they accidentally kick a player's ball, the player is not going to be responsible for any penalty. They're treated as an outside influence, meaning that the player would be required to put the ball back in the spot, would not get a penalty, and on you go. There may be other reasons why outside influence, I mean, on the putting green and so forth.
There could be Rule 8 issues.
All right, that's all I have online. So after Rule 25 here.
All right, well, we will keep going and we'll finish things off with Rule 25, which is a new rule for this year. And a very, this is, a lot of people would say the most important change to the rules for this year, that just to provide some historical context. Ever since the mid to late 1990s, the USGA and the RNA have had a set of suggested modifications and local rules that allow players with disabilities to compete. And now that set of modifications in local rules have been incorporated into the rules themselves, which, has a very big, symbolic and philosophical message in terms of accessibility and inclusion, and also, certain practical benefits as well, such as, keeping in mind that before this year, if a committee wanted to adopt, needed to adopt this, the committee needed to take the proactive measure of putting local rules into effect. And, there could be some surprises. I remember maybe 2 or 3 years ago at a WSGA event, I want to say it may have been maybe, do you remember, it was like a qualifier for the state am or something? A player showed up at the first tee saying, "I'm blind," and blah, blah, blah. And, we didn't know that we had a blind golfer in the field. So, it hadn't occurred to us to adopt those local rules. So now that, since this is part of the rules, that puts, all committees on sounder footing, with unexpected situations like that. And as I said, also it just, promotes the idea or for, golf for players that fall into these categories. And certainly, a number of you probably aware that last year was the inaugural U.S. Adaptive Open conducted by the USGA at Pinehurst. And, speaking with officials who were there, sounds like it was just a great success. And, a lot of them said that was, perhaps the highlight of their officiating career. So, very important addition to the rules. And with this, we might not dwell on the details, but we need to be aware of them and aware of what is there. So when the situation arises, we have a good understanding of what the situation is, as well as where we can refer to for more information. First, the purpose of the rule is to provide modifications to certain rules to allow players with specific disabilities to play fairly with players who have no disabilities, the same disability, or a different type of disabilities. So that's the whole purpose, is for fair competition between those three groups of players. And just, on the USGA website, they do have a little bit more information under the rules section called Guidance for National Governing Bodies, which, grant, WSGA is not, but is still has some helpful information and background. So let's start with the overview. Now, Rule 25 applies to all competitions. Hence, the player's category of disability and eligibility that determine whether they can use this specific modified rules in Rule 25. And we'll see that the sections of this are broken down into, the specific disabilities, which are players who are blind, which also includes certain levels of just vision impairment, players who are amputees, which includes both limb deficiencies and those who have lost a limb, assistive mobility devices, such as wheelchairs, and players with intellectual disabilities. Now, it goes on to say that there are players with other types of disabilities. These additional categories of disability are not covered in Rule 25, as to date, no requirement's been identified that's needed to modify the rules for those players. But the fact that this says to date indicates that the USGA and the RNA certainly are keeping an open mind and don't pretend to know everything when it comes to these areas. Now, the equipment rules also apply without modification, except with what's in Section 7, and we'll go through some equipment issues. So first section will deal with players who are blind. And we'll see one of the big changes is that they are allowed to be assisted by both a caddy as well as an aide. And we'll talk about what an aide is at the same time for help with aiming and gives the player limited exception to the prohibitions on touching sand in the bunker with the club and allows help with lifting, dropping, placing, and replacing the ball. So these modifications all stem specifically from the vision impairment there. So first section talking about help from an aid. Player who's blind may get help from an aid in taking a stance, with aiming before the stroke, and by asking for and getting advice. Now, an aid has the same status under the rules as a caddy, but with the exceptions described below in section 2E. And for the purpose of the advice rule, a player may ask for and get advice from both an aid and a caddy at the same time. So while a player is allowed to have both an aid and a caddy, he's allowed to have only one aid at a time. So now we get into some specific modifications for players who are blind. Rule 10.2b3, in terms of setting down objects and so forth, is modified so there's no penalty if the player, caddy, or aid sets down an object to help with aiming or to help in taking a stance for the stroke to be made, but that object must be removed before the stroke is made. Next, 10.2b4, the restricted area is that provision is modified so that there's no penalty if the aid or caddy is positioned on or close to an extension line of play behind the ball at any time before or during the stroke, so long as the aid or caddy does not help the player in making the stroke. But certainly, a player who is blind is going to need help in lining up, and that's understood. Caddies, the aid may also serve as the player's caddy, but is not required to do so. Now, if the player is allowed to have both an aid and a caddy, and if the player does so, the aid must not carry or handle the player's clubs. That's the big distinction. So the two are not entirely interchangeable. That's the big distinction. Then on to Rule 12. And again, keeping in mind we're dealing with blind players. Before making a stroke of the ball in a bunker, player who is blind may touch sand in the bunker with the club in the area right in front of or right behind the ball, as well as in making the backswing for a stroke. Because without that touching of the sand, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, for the player to know where his ball is. So that's why that is allowed. But the player is not allowed to improve the lie of the ball more than what would happen from lightly grounding the club. Now, the player is still subject to the prohibitions from the bunker rule about deliberately touching the sand for the purpose of testing the condition, as well as touching the sand and making a practice swing. It's just that by touching the sand, that helps the player find where the ball is. And then Rule 14.1b, lifting the ball on the putting green, and the aid as well as the caddy may lift the ball without the player's authorization. Help with dropping, placing, and replacing. The player is allowed without limitation to give general authorization to any person to drop, place, and replace the ball. So, something ordinarily is not done, but a player may, for example, tell an aid or a caddy, you have the authority for the entire round to drop, place, and replace the ball. That's okay. So moving on to next section with amputees, which include, they may well need the use of a prosthetic device. And also we'll see there can be certain allowances for making a stroke while anchoring the club, as well as help in dropping, placing, and replacing the ball. First, dealing with the prosthetic devices themselves. Use of an artificial arm or leg is not of itself a breach of Rule 4.3, as long as the player, 1, has a medical reason to use it, and 2, the committee for that competition decides that the use does not give the player an unfair advantage over other players. Now, players in doubt should raise the matter as soon as possible with the committee, because you don't want to be the player who walks to the first tee saying, hey, is it okay if I use this device, and put the committee on the spot? Because among other things, one, you're putting the committee on the spot, and two, the committee might say, well, we need to think about it. To be safe, don't use it until we make a decision. And that decision might take 6 hours, 6 holes to make. So by all means, raise that with the committee as early as you can. Now, if the player who is an amputee is unable to hold and swing the majority of their clubs without anchoring because of limb deficiencies or limb loss, the player may make a stroke while anchoring the club. So, but that's qualifications. If players and amputees unable to hold and swing the majority of the clubs without anchoring because of their condition, they are allowed to anchor. Next, help with dropping, placing, and replacing. An amputee may give general authorization to any other person to drop, place, or replace their ball, just as we saw with blind players. And then modification to the definition of replace. Remember, which has a very narrow meaning in the rules now. This is going to allow more leeway for amputees. So the player may replace the ball either by hand or by using another piece of equipment, such as rolling the ball with the club, because the requirement to replace it by hand could in some cases be might not be reasonable for some amputees. Next section deals with players who use assistive mobility devices. We'll talk about how they may have both an aid and a caddy, and how the player may use the device to help in taking a stance and making a stroke, as well as, for practical reasons, how certain relief procedures are modified. So when we talk about assistive mobility devices, it could be something like a cane or a crutch, wheelchairs, or other wheeled mobility devices. Sometimes you'll see the carts that have a chair that can swing out and get the player in a better position to play from. So a player using an assistive mobility device may get help from an aide or any other person in these ways, such as lifting the ball on the putting green, dropping, placing, or replacing, as well as player may get physical help from any person to help position the player or position or remove the assistive mobility device. Advice from aid. We'll see that a player may have both an aid and a caddy. An aid has the same status under the rules as a caddy. Players allowed only one aid. A modification of definition of stance. Now, normally, we say in the rules, players allowed to, players' use of an assistive mobility device may affect their stance for the purposes of various rules, such as in determining the area of intended stance under Rule 8.1a, as well as determining if there's interference by an abnormal course condition under Rule 16.1. To address this, definition of stance is modified to mean the position of the player's feet and body and the position of an assistive mobility device if one is used in preparing for making a stroke. So, for example, if a player playing from a wheelchair, if part of that wheelchair is on a cart path, that would be considered the player would have interference with area of intended stance and therefore could take relief. With replacing this will allow the player to replace the ball by hand as well as by using another piece of equipment. Again, because that's continuing with the example of a player in a wheelchair, it's not reasonable to expect him to replace the ball by hand. So he can put it on the ground and then roll it into position with the club. With equipment, player is allowed to use assistive mobility devices to help their play, as long as that's allowed under Rule 4.3b. And the player using the device is still subject to the prohibitions against using the equipment in an abnormal way. Modification to 8.1b5 about taking this, that's the provision that prohibits players from building a stance. But this modifies it to say there's no penalty if the player improves the conditions affecting the stroke by firmly placing the feet and taking a stance. Normally, the rule itself allows the player a reasonable amount of digging in with the feet in the sand. And with an assistive mobility device, a reasonable amount of digging in with that device is allowed, as well as taking reasonable actions to position an assistive mobility device, taking the stance to try to avoid slipping, with emphasis on reasonable there. This modification does not let the player go beyond that by building a stance so that the assistive mobility device will not slip during the swing, such as by creating a raised mound of sand against which to brace the device. So there is a line there, depending on what is reasonable. Anchoring the club, again, note that this is qualified. If a player is unable to hold and swing the majority of their clubs without anchoring, because of the use of an assistive mobility device, the player may make a stroke while anchoring the club. Then next, Rule 10.1c, to take into account the use of this device, 10.1c is modified so the player must also not make a stroke with any part of their assistive mobility device deliberately placed on each side of or touching the line of play or extension of that line behind the ball. So deliberately taking a stance with the device is not allowed. Caddies, the player may have both an aid and a caddy. As we saw before, the aid must not carry or handle the player's clubs. Rule 11.1b, so talking about accidental deflections of ball in motion, is modified so that if a player's ball in motion played from a putting green is accidentally deflected by the assistive mobility device, the ball must be played as it lies, just as if it had struck the player's foot, for example. Rule 12.2b, 1, in a bunker. Normally, the rule itself provides that a player must not deliberately touch the sand for the purpose of testing the condition. And this applies to using an assistive mobility device to deliberately test the condition of the sand also. But the player may touch the sand with the device for any other purpose without penalty. Then lateral relief for a ball in a red penalty area or for an unplayable ball, because of the practical issues involved in terms of moving these devices around and getting in position to play, that 2 club length relief area has been expanded to 4 club lengths. Then for an unplayable ball relief in a bunker, we know that for 2019, there was a new relief option that allowed the player to come outside the bunker for 2 penalty strokes. But now this will allow the player with a with a wheeled mobility device. So it's not just any assistive mobility device, but a wheeled one. So not someone with, say, a cane or crutches is allowed to take back on line relief behind the bunker for 1 penalty stroke and not 2. And then the next section, the 4th disability, is players with intellectual disabilities. They're allowed to be assisted by both an aide and a caddy, as well as we'll introduce a supervisor. And we'll see that a supervisor is someone who's not assigned to a specific player and is not allowed to give advice. All right, so the extent of help that players with intellectual disabilities may need will be specific to each individual. The committee may provide or allow for an aide or supervisor to help players. An aide, the difference is an aide helps an individual player. And as we've seen before, an aide has the same status as a caddy. Player may get advice from an aide, whereas a supervisor is someone designated by the committee to help all the players with intellectual disabilities during the competition. This person is not assigned to a specific player, is not an outside influence, and may not give advice. As we've seen before, a player is allowed only one aide at a time. Player is allowed to have both an aide and a caddy, but the aide must not carry or handle the player's clubs. Rule 14.1b, the player's aide may lift the player's ball without the player's authorization. For players that have both intellectual and physical disabilities, it's recommended the committee use a combination of the rules in 25 in order to address both types of disabilities. All right, general provisions. We'll finish with unreasonable delay. Certainly, it's certainly a possibility, but given the practical and logistical issues involved, each committee should use its discretion and set its own reasonable standards, taking into account the difficulty of the course, the weather conditions, and the nature of the competition, as well as the extent of the disabilities, to determine what's a reasonable pace of play. And it may be appropriate to use a more relaxed interpretation of what constitutes unreasonable delay. Because players with these disabilities, it just, as a matter of necessity, could well take them more time to make a stroke than it would someone else. With dropping the ball, because physical limitations may make it difficult or impossible for players with certain disabilities to know whether they have dropped from knee height, the committee should accept the player's reasonable judgment that they have done so. Also, the committee should accept all reasonable efforts to drop the ball from knee height, taking into account the player's physical limitations. So committees really just need to, be reasonable and appreciate that in cases like that, players are doing absolutely the best they can physically to do that. So any questions on Rule 25 there? If not, just want to thank everyone for this session, these 5 rules sessions this winter. It's amazing to think that here in Wisconsin, we're still 3 months away from our tournament season. But thanks everyone for participating. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you for your interest in the rules, and especially to those here in Wisconsin that are doing this to help WSGA members have the best competitive experience that they can. Thank you all for that, and we look forward to seeing you during the season when there's not during the golf season without snow outside. So thank you all.